"Sing the songs of God like you sing the songs of the devil," said John Wesley, and the Methodist Church became known as a singing church. On the American frontier, where people were more apt to sing than to read, congregational singing achieved a special potency, which reached its height in the Tinted Grove. From this experience came a new brand of hymn, the revival spiritual, which melded the Scotch-Irish ballad with the African chant to produce an oral Bible wild as an autumn storm. My name is Boyce Holloman, and in this documentary, we will seek the roots of the camp meeting tradition, which began nearly 2 centuries ago in Kentucky, and which, I might add, is still alive and well in the piney woods of South Mississippi. Today, 4 campgrounds, described as Methodist, but by no means limited to that religious persuasion, are places of annual resort in the Mississippi Panhandle. These are, in the order of establishment: Salem in North Jackson County, Mount Pleasant in South George County, New Prospect in Central Jackson County, and Palmer Creek in Central Harrison County. Outdoor religious services have been a part of the human experience from the beginning of religious expression, and such services were a hallmark of early Christianity. John Wesley resorted to open-air preaching in the 1730s when denied the use of church buildings in England. This strategy moved Methodism out of doors at its inception. Then Wesley's colleague, George Whitefield, stormed America in 1740, igniting the Great Awakening by preaching in field and forest, and thus firmly implanting the idea of the woodland revival in the New World. In the decades following the Great Awakening of the early 1740s, religious enthusiasm waned. By the 1790s, church membership was on a decline throughout the United States. By this time, hundreds of thousands of unchurched pioneers had moved beyond the Appalachians, pushing the frontier line ever westward through Ohio, Kentucky, Tennessee, and Mississippi. Life was often nasty, brutal, and short for the pioneer isolated in the wilderness, in a log cabin, on a hard-scrabble farm. And when he was not fighting for his existence against nature and savages, he was struggling to endure a crushingly monotonous life. The social and spiritually starved frontiersman existed in an emotional vacuum, alleviated at long intervals by the visit of a Methodist circuit rider. The Methodist circuit rider was sort of a spiritual cavalryman who accompanied the common people on the westward movement. He might ride a circuit as big as a present-day state and draw a salary as small as $12.10 a year. His zeal drove him down every trace and track to every wilderness cabin where he slipped into legend and into the heart of America. Every denizen of the frontier knew the circuit rider by his grave, earnest countenance and the staid gait of the horse. The very looks of a Methodist preacher struck terror in the sinner's heart. His somber costume advertised his calling. For protection against the elements, he wore a big coat, leggings in the winter, and carried an umbrella. A familiar expression on the frontier in times of bitter cold and rain was, "There is nothing out today but crows and Methodist preachers." For a while, the Methodist spiritual cavalryman was content to contest the devil for a cabin at a time. Then at the dawn of the 19th century, fate placed heavy artillery in the circuit rider's arsenal, and he used it, the camp meeting. At the time, ministers of the gospel prayed for another great religious awakening, and scattered frontier families, yearning for any human contact, were willing to oblige if some means could be devised to achieve it. Fiery Presbyterian minister John McCready applied the match to the powder keg of prayer and yearning. He plastered the Kentucky frontier with posters announcing a protracted meeting to be held in July 1800 at Gaspar River. Families were invited to come provision to camp. So began a new religious institution, camp meeting, and a vast national outpouring of religious fervor now known in American history as the Second Great Awakening. Gaspar River was the first planned camp meeting in America and probably in the world. Presbyterians shared the preaching stand with Methodist circuit riders specifically invited for the occasion. Together, they delivered an uninterrupted barrage of fire and brimstone into the ranks of the penitents, some of whom had journeyed 100 miles or more. Pine knot torches lit the enraptured faces of black and white, young and old. Dawn found most of the covered wagons and tents empty of occupants. Some seemed to forget both sleep and hunger for the 4 days of the meeting. As news of Gaspar River crackled along the frontier, Presbyterian, Methodist, and Baptist ministers united to hold one emotionally charged revival after another during the long hot summer of 1800. By the following summer, word of this religious device, with its sociability, its simplicity, and its emotional magnetism, had spread throughout Kentucky and Tennessee. Consequently, the response was overwhelming when Presbyterian preacher Barton W. Stone flooded the frontier with notices of a camp meeting to begin August 6, 1801 at Cane Ridge, Kentucky. Stone and 18 other ministers, including Methodists and Baptists, found themselves facing 10,000 to 25,000 socially deprived and sin-sick frontiersmen in what rapidly disintegrated into a religious Woodstock. Several eyewitnesses among the clergy and laity at Cane Ridge left their impressions of the most disorderly, the most hysterical, and the largest camp meeting of early-day America. One said, "The noise was like the roar of Niagara. The vast sea of human beings seemed to be agitated as if by storm." Said another, "I counted 7 ministers, all preaching at one time, some on stumps, others in wagons, and one was standing on a tree which had fallen and lodged against another," he recalled. On one of the platforms stood a black preacher addressing his race. For 6 days and nights, the frenzied worship continued without intermission. Some preachers slept while others labored in the pulpit, pouring hot shot into Satan's ranks. Some of the people were singing, others praying, some piteously crying for mercy. Others were shouting loudly, or running, or fainting, or swooning. An eyewitness said he saw at least 500 people swept down in a moment, as if a battery of 1,000 guns had been opened upon them, and then immediately followed shrieks and shouts that rent the very heaven. Many were afflicted with a phenomenon known as the jerks. In the case of young ladies, fine bonnets, caps, and combs flew, and so sudden would be the jerking of the head that their long, loose hair crackled almost as loud as a wagoner's whip. The tumult and disorder of Cane Ridge was to have been expected of isolated, rustic people suddenly thrust into the charged atmosphere of a tent city sprung up overnight in the wilderness. As a result, Presbyterians, along with the Baptists, feared they could not control their brash and bawling infant, so they abandoned it. And the Methodists, who knew they could tame it, adopted the boisterous child. Circuit-riding Methodist Bishop Francis Asbury captured the vision, exclaiming, "Camp meeting, the battle axe and weapon of war. It will break down the walls of wickedness and enable us to storm the devil's strongholds and the forts of hell. And he added, we must attend to camp meetings. They make our harvest times. But he also set forth this admonition: order, order, good order. All things must be arranged temporally and spiritually, like a well-disciplined army. So the Methodists, famed for systematic habits of devotion, checked the excesses and harnessed the exuberant power of the woodland Bethels to reach a rich harvest of souls. And nature dictated that the spiritual harvest would follow the temporal one. Hence it came to pass that camp meeting became an annual event in late summer or early fall after the crops were laid by. Circuit rider Tobias Gibson brought Methodism to Mississippi in 1799. That year, at the village of Washington near Natchez, he established the denomination's first congregation, composed of 3 white couples and 1 slave couple. A few years later, Lorenzo Dow, the most famous and most eccentric of all Methodist circuit riders, blazed a hellfire and brimstone preaching trail from Georgia to Washington. In December 1804, Dow held the first camp meeting in Mississippi on Clear Creek near Washington Church. Dow then retraced his steps, preaching at every opportunity. While Dow's exact route is not known, he certainly preached in South Mississippi, as he had passed through, coming and going. But no regular circuit rider served South Mississippi until Matthew Sturdivant arrived in 1808. Sturdivant and the circuit riders who came after him set about establishing churches, or societies as the Methodists call them, among the pioneer families then pouring into South Mississippi from the Carolinas, Georgia, and Alabama. Among these families were the Carters and Goss, who settled along Cedar Creek in Jackson County, and the Ramseys, who founded Ramsey Springs in present Stone County. According to a Georgia passport, 16 members of the Carter-Goff clan entered Mississippi in 1811, bringing 3 slaves with them. 15 years later, the Carters and Goss founded Salem Camp Meeting, and the descendants of those slaves established Mount Pleasant Camp Meeting after emancipation. In the fall of 1826, the Carters, Goffs, and allied families constructed a brush arbor tabernacle next to the log church on their land near Cedar Creek. They announced that a camp meeting would be held Thursday through Monday, September the 21st through the 26th. 18-year-old Abizar Clark Ramsey of Ramsey Springs undertook the arduous 30-mile journey to the site and left us this account of his experience. I quote, "No sooner did I get in hearing of the ground at night than a thrill ran over me. Brother T.S. Abernathy preached. Mourners were called, but I would not go forward until Sunday night, when I saw and felt that something must be done for me or I would be lost. I ventured forward, and about midnight the clouds dispersed, joy and peace took possession of my poor soul, and I could rejoice with those that did rejoice, and weep with those that wept. The next morning the sun rose. Oh, how lovely! Nature seemed to put on a more beautiful garment than ever before. Brother Abernathy opened the door of the church, and I gave him my hand as a Methodist," Ramsey recalled. In the early 1840s, Salem's original log church and brush arbor burned, and the present site, about a mile from the first, was selected for rebuilding. Here the brush arbor evolved into a wooden tabernacle, and the tents gave way first to log and then to clapboard cabins, ranging about the tabernacle in a hollow square. But the word tent was retained as a designation of these permanent family shelters, though sometimes, particularly at Salem, they are referred to as camps. Many of these feature all the comforts of home, but some of these tents still retain their Methodist carpeting of crunchy pine straw, renewed each year. But modern mattresses have replaced the pine straw bedding of yesteryear. Electricity reached Salem in the early 1940s. Before that, scaffolds or elevated fire stands located about the ground provided outdoor lighting, while candles and lanterns served inside the tabernacles and tents. Lily Bird Fairley, age 90, in 1988, remembers.
On the grounds we called them scaffolds, you know, and there was 4 posts to each scaffold covered with lumber. Then they fixed the top of that with dirt so the wood wouldn't catch the fire. And it took a lot of wood for that, for several of them on the grounds, you know, and it made good lights. And the men all worked together and kept that going. And
Camp meeting was and is a socio-religious institution that is both a time of devotion and a holiday occasion for the whole family. For the housewives, it was a relief from lonely domestic drudgery. For the men, it was a welcome break from farming, trapping, and hunting. For the children, it was a time to make new friends. For the teenagers, it was a time for sparking and frenzied courting. The encampments became the primary courting grounds for the area they served. As W.H. Sparks put it, here in the evening's twilight has been plighted many a vow, which has been redeemed by happy unions for life's journey. His observation was true. Matches made at camp meetings resulted in countless marriages, which produced new generations to carry forth the campground tradition. By 1988, Salem had existed for 8 generations, and it was possible to find in one tent 5 generations, ranging in age from 1-year-old Aaron Stevenson to 100-year-old Lily Cochran. From generation to generation, the women planned for the event all year, and each saved her best pickles and preserves for the grand occasion. Cooking was done by groups of women, each seemingly determined to outdo the other in turning out the best banquet fare.
we moved to camp meeting on Wednesday, and in a horse and wagon. We had to bring the water from the branch. And was back in the little kitchen was all from the tent. And we had a stove back in there in the wood, and brought the water from the branch, and we had iron pots and skillets, big skillets, you know, and that's the way we did the cooking. Then we had to bring it from this kitchen. There was a space between the tent and this kitchen.
One veteran described camp meeting as the most mammoth picnic possible, and it's no one's fault, saint or sinner, if he gets not enough to eat, and that the best the land affords, he added. For those without sustenance, meals at moderate prices were available at boarding tents, now called public tents in South Mississippi, but many feasted on food generously provided by other campers. One circuit preacher urged the women to bring only the plainest fare to camp meeting: dried beef, boiled ham, or pork, bread, and no vegetables except potatoes. His aim was to free the women for worship, but his advice likely fell on deaf ears, perhaps not women's, but everybody else's, for the feast continues unabated. Some of the large camp meetings were dubbed by the uncharitable as circuses of the backwoods and religious fairs. A few probably deserve those labels. In some cases, wily politicians managed to finagle a chance to say a few words, and instead said a lot. Merchants of all types selling a variety of goods set up shop in the nearby woods if they were denied entrance to the ground. Mischievous rowdies seeking anything but religion flocked to the meeting. As one woman put it, when the sons of God assembled together, Satan came also. But some who came to mock remained to pray. Sometimes the pageantry did rival circuses and fairs, and the fluttering banners, wildfire songs, and blaring trumpets reminded other onlookers of preparation for a crusade. Today at Salem, the trumpeting of a conch shell in use at least since the early 1850s is the assembling device. Camp meeting preachers usually consisted of the pastor in charge and a number of circuit riders. The orators were assigned times according to ability. At 8 a.m., the warm-up preacher went in to prepare the way for the main event, the 11 o'clock service. An 11 o'clock preacher was the attending son of thunder who gave what was expected, an extemporaneous, hair-hung and breeze-shaken over hell sermon designed to quail the most hardened and sinful heart. The 11 o'clock preachers brought in the sheaves. Few self-conscious sinners could withstand the rampant persuasiveness of these hellfire sermons. A preacher who could not bellow like a scrub bull in a cane brake during cockleberry season had little success in the pulpit. Salem evangelist H.J. Hedgepeth explains the difference between regular and camp meeting preaching.
The thing that's different about camp meeting is the style in which you preach. The sermon may be the same, but here at camp meeting you're preaching for conversions and recommitments. You're preaching maybe a little more boisterous. It's really an exciting time for me, and we feel like some good decisions have been made this week and will be made throughout the day.
Special separate services for men, women, and children are scheduled at Salem throughout the week. The prayer log service, conducted daily at 5 p.m., is a uniquely male institution. Grover Donaldson, age 63 in 1988, has been coming to the Salem prayer log for 55 years.
Even though I know that it must have been a prayer log in the camp meetings history long before my time. And I believe that prayer has been a significant thing in the longevity of this campground, and I think that as long as we continue to meet here and pray, that the Holy Spirit will continue to do its work, and we'll have camp meeting in the future.
One theory holds that the prayer log originated as the site of slave services at antebellum Salem. The democratic gospel of Methodism coincided with the democratic taste of the frontiersmen. At the camp meeting, no class distinction was recognized, not even slavery. The barriers separating blacks and whites were social and economic, but not religious. The Methodist Church in particular encouraged mixed congregation. Black clergymen were authorized as early as 1800. And two black Methodist leaders of the day were Richard Allen and Francis Burns. At Salem, the blacks and whites sometimes worshiped together, and sometimes the black held their own camp meetings in tandem with the whites. According to the meager surviving information, the Salem preachers held separate services for the slaves by the horse lock, and slaves sometimes sat on special pews erected outside the tabernacle behind the pulpit. A.C. Ramsey, who became a circuit rider after his conversion at Salem's initial meeting in 1826, tells us of a black preacher named Levin McRae, who preached to both the blacks and whites at a camp meeting in 1832 near Leakesville, Mississippi. In any case, the Salem slaves attended Salem camp meeting before the war between the states and continued to attend long after emancipation. Then, near the close of the 19th century, they established their own campground on the Salem model, 5 miles north of Mount Pleasant. Charles Grant, president of the Mount Pleasant Campground Association and the grandson of Salem slaves, justifiably claims that Mount Pleasant, a black Salem, shares the mother ground's antiquity. So, Mount Pleasant is the nation's oldest black camp meeting, and is also likely the only black Methodist campground in the United States.
Joe Grant was my grandfather on my daddy's side. Hampton Lawrence was my granddaddy on my mother's side. They both attended the camp meeting at Salem, even before they were freed. There was a connection between the ex-slaves and the ex-masters. There was a cordial and a loving relationship that they maintained all the while that any of them lived. After emancipation, these slaves decided, which was around about in the 80s, to build them a campground similar to that of the Salem campground. Very likely the first tabernacle was a brush harbor, the way they tell me, and it didn't last too long until they built probably some wooden buildings and tabernacles.
After losing their tabernacle once to fire and again in a hurricane, the people of Mount Pleasant built a more permanent concrete block structure. Inside the tabernacle, before the main service on a big Sunday, the congregation practices an ancient form of Holy Communion, dating back to the earliest days of Christianity. Called the Love Feast, the members witness for Christ one to another as they share his symbolic flesh and blood. Another very special communion, this one by candlelight, is practiced by the congregation of New Prospect Campground. A number of families, some of the Salem connection, founded New Prospect in 1880 on the west side of the Pascagoula River. Now the largest South Mississippi camp meeting, New Prospect resembles a small village complete with streets and a water tower. Candlelight communion services were a regular feature of early camp meetings, but the practice had died out until revived in 1978 by the Reverend Jess Baker.
But this has become a very joyful time, a time of celebration, as by candlelight we have the communion where we break the loaf and where we pass the bread among the people, where we have the cup, and then following that, the candle is lit from the Christ candle. It's distributed out to all of the people who are here. And then in a sea of light, we stand and we sing Jacob's Ladder, and we exit the tabernacle. And then after we're outside the tabernacle, we usually sing a little bit, have a prayer, and we go home. And it's a very beautiful and wonderful expression of love and faith in Christ. And we feel like we're one with all of the people who have been over the 100 years on this campground, that the saints are with us, in communion with us.
Palmer Creek Campground was established in Harrison County in 1883. Like the other three, it serves all age groups and draws communicants from all over the nation, some in mobile tents. Among the older worshipers at Palmer Creek in 1988 was Blanche Stewart Robinson. She was 91 at the time and had never missed a camp meeting. Neither had 19-year-old Heidi Hoffman of Chicago. Year after year, regardless of the weather, the people gather for that old-time religion. And sometimes late in the day on Big Sunday, there is conducted a ritual as old as Christianity itself, baptism. The Reverend George Phillips explains the relationship of camp meeting and baptism.
Most of the baptisms took place in the local community with the church community surrounding the experience itself. Occasionally, there were baptisms in some stream or pond that was nearby, but this was always because of the request of the individual. Maybe they liked a certain preacher and wanted him to do the baptizing rather than wait until they got home. And so they would ask to be baptized, but it was always after the camp meeting was closed.
So, what of the future of the campgrounds of South Mississippi? Bill Wilkerson, president of the Salem Campground Association, says,
it's going to continue on. I know I'm comfortable believing in my family that when my wife and I move out of the picture, that our camp will be continued on. I think our children are that deeply rooted into the camp meeting spirit.
We're doing everything we can to, at the beginning of every session, to have a brief history of the camp meeting and the purpose for which it was organized, and hoping that the young folk will accept this and work hard to maintain their purpose.
The determination of American pioneers to escape from an isolated existence for a time of spiritual renewal birthed the camp meeting tradition. Some camp meetings have survived in a few remote areas where the strangling steel and plastic scaffolding of modern civilization could not reach. And they will continue to survive because they lasted long enough for the children of those early pioneers to develop a desire almost the opposite of their ancestors, the heartfelt wish to retreat to an isolated spiritual existence for a season and sing the songs of God like you sing the song of the devil.